Hey everyone, in this video I'm using a little bit of a different setup because I've been asked by a number of people, how do I actually present to a customer? Do I still use the whiteboard? Do I draw? Do I use PowerPoint? And so I wanted to walk through a conversation I actually had this week, but I thought I'd record it so you could see what I actually do day to day. So I do not use my studio. I do not use the big whiteboard when I present to customers. I think it's a little bit maybe too over the top, but I do like to use the whiteboard. And so what I do in my case, I have an iPad and I use the pencil. But you could obviously use any device that can run the whiteboard app, something you can draw on. I think the mouse is very difficult for a fidelity perspective, so I think you do want some kind of stylus. You could join the meeting directly from your device and just screen share. I'm projecting to an air server running on the PC. And then obviously I like to have the camera so you can connect with the audience a little bit more. But that's it. There's no really fancy setup. So all I'm going to do is walk through a conversation talking about the Azure Bare Metal service and Azure Arc. And really just, you can see how I still try and use both the whiteboard for the visual, but I want it to complement the audio. That's why I don't like PowerPoint. PowerPoint, there's this big slide, and I don't think it complements well. Unless you build out the PowerPoint really well, the PowerPoint distracts from the audio because people are reading ahead. They're trying to work out, well, what does this mean? So I think drawing it out as you talk about it, the audio and the visual complement each other to really help emphasize the point. And of course, then the whiteboard becomes a takeaway that the audience can have. So let's kind of get going and how I would think about using it and what that process really is. So I want to start off with thinking about, okay, well, we have the cloud, and really what is that cloud when we think about it? So if I think about for a second Azure, hey, great, we have this idea of this cloud service, and really what is that cloud service bringing me? Well, it's a whole set of capacity. So I can think there's capacity, and there's no real magic to any of this. Behind the scenes, well, there are still servers. I can think there's compute. I can think about, well, there's storage. I can think about, well, there's networking. And all of this different types of fabric that's giving me this capacity, well, it's made available through regions. So we go and use certain regions where I want to consume that capacity. Now, what's happening behind the scenes, obviously, is that physical hardware is broken down into virtual environments. And so there is a hypervisor. Obviously, in the Azure case, it's built on Hyper-V, but we have a hypervisor running over that physical set of fabric. And then once that's in place, that capacity is exposed to us as the customer through various types of resource. Now, I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on all the different resources available in Azure, but obviously I can think about VMs. VM is the most obvious type. So we have an operating system. We might install various types of runtime like .NET, J2E. And then we have the business application we care about, and obviously it's data. And I think about, this is the infrastructure as a service. So my flexibility, my responsibility as the customer is all of those things. I can really install any OS I want within reason. I can put any runtime, any app, but I'm responsible for all of those elements, the patching, the antivirus, the firewall, the configuration, the backup, the HA, the DR. But there are things in Azure that help me with all of those. I just own the responsibility. But then I can also think about, well, there are PaaS services. So in a PaaS world, things like that operating system and the runtime, that's the responsibility of the platform. It's still there, but I'm not worrying about that. It's just provided for me. I get to just focus on, hey, my app and my data. And so I can think about, hey, this nice platform as a service. And there are many different platform as a service offerings. Obviously, there's things around the app services. So, hey, functions and web apps and logic apps, a huge set of services there. There are the data services. I can think about managed database offerings, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL MI, managed Postgres, managed MySQL, managed MariaDB, Cosmos DB. There are machine learning services, training, all these different types of service are exposed as the PaaS. And wherever possible, I want to try and use a PaaS service if a SaaS isn't available, because I want to focus on my business app. I don't really want to be managing operating systems and patching them and worrying about runtimes. I want to focus what differentiates me and my business value, which is, hey, let's dedicate my resources to thinking about the app. And I only want to do the minimum I have to do operationally to be able to deliver and differentiate my service. So there's a huge number of different capabilities here, and there's a huge set of benefits we get, but they're all running fundamentally on virtual machines. They're all running on a hypervisor. Now, there are certain workloads, certain applications that either because of maybe the tiny performance penalty that the hypervisor introduces, which is very, very minimal these days, especially when you have things like accelerated networking, it's really minimizing that. Maybe it's certain drivers are required that need to go directly to the hardware. Maybe it's certain hardware sets have to be meeting some specification and signed off by the application to be supported. So there are times where I cannot run in a virtual machine. I need bare metal to meet the requirements of the workload. And it's for those very specific types of applications that Azure has a bare metal offering. So I can think about, there are specific configurations. So this now is running on the same data centers, but now you get this idea of these specific bare metal SKUs. So there's no hypervisor, still running in the Azure data centers. And then the way this works is Microsoft installs one of the operating systems that are available. There still needs a specific OS to meet and have the drivers and the specs to run on these particular hardware configs. So I can think, hey, you pick the operating system, but it's installed for me. But then beyond that, I really do whatever I want on top of that thing. So at this point, hey, any run times, and really the important thing here is the app you deploy on top of that. But it is targeted at very, very specific workloads. This is not designed to just be, hey, a box, put what you want on it. It's geared towards those workloads that have very specific hardware requirements. For example, today we think about, this started out with SAP. SAP had very specific requirements around the hardware. Then they added configurations specific to Oracle. Once again, they have very specific requirements. And then Nutanix cloud clusters, there's support for those as well. And this is shown in the documentation. If you jump over and look at the docs for a second, and we'll go and look here, when we look at the documentation, it actually talks about the workloads, and we can see it's called out very clearly. SAP HANA, Oracle, and NC2. And what it's doing is there are specific SKUs for each of these based around, well, what are the certification requirements to be able to be supported and run that particular hardware. So they might have different storage configurations, they might access different remote storage, different networking, different sizes are available within these, but it's very, very targeted to meet those requirements for those particular workloads. So that is the point and the goal of the bare metal offerings. Hey, I have these specific workloads, SAP, Oracle, NC2. I want to move them to Azure so they can interoperate. Maybe I want to get out of my data centers. Maybe I want to interoperate with other Azure services, so I want them near, so we get those low latencies, great performance. But hey, they can't run in a virtual machine. So that's what the bare metal offerings are for. Now, one of the things I would really stress is don't think just because something runs a certain way on premises, it has to run the same way when you move to Azure. Hey, it's running in a VM on premises. Doesn't mean it has to run in a VM in Azure. I'm running a website. Well, that would probably be better in a PaaS service. Run it in a web app. Hey, I've got some job that's looking for a certain event. Hey, don't run that in a VM. Put it as an Azure function or a logic app. Hey, I have something running on bare metal on premises. Can I virtualize it in Azure? Again, these are state-of-the-art hypervisors with state-of-the-art capabilities. Maybe I can virtualize that workload. It doesn't need bare metal. Maybe the reasons it needed bare metal on premises maybe no longer apply. Technology is advanced. There's different capabilities. So take some time to reevaluate as we move workloads to the cloud, because maybe I can shift those responsibilities and be responsible for less and really optimize how I spend my time. So just take a second to always think about any workload and, well, can I change that story? So that's the bare metal SKUs. Really, it's focused around these key applications that through certification requirements, I don't want on a hypervisor. I need very, very specific hardware configurations. And then I can think about, well, Azure, great. Azure had services, PaaS and IaaS, but it also brings this great control plane. So when I actually think about Azure, one of its big benefits is it has the Azure Resource Manager. So I can think, well, that control plane is ARM, the Azure Resource Manager, and really any interactions we ever do go through that control plane. But also as part of that, it offers a lot of services. So I can think about, well, I can always see all of my Azure services. I know what I have. So we have things like inventory. We have great tagging capabilities. So I can tag my resources for tracking, to find them, to maybe apply certain types of policy around them. We have great role-based access control, very granular sets of permissions to particular people, so I can think about least privilege. There are ways to then act on that and elevate privileges as needed. There's Azure Policy. When policy, I think about the ability to track compliance. Hey, this is what I want it to be. Is it? I can track compliance, helps me track the governance, but I can also enforce. I can put down the guardrails to say, hey, as you're deploying, as you're changing, you have to stay within these. I can even remediate. Hey, if it doesn't match this, go and make it so. There are a whole set of defender solutions. So when I think about all the different types of resource, when I want to understand, well, what's a possible compromises happening? What are potential factors and configurations that may expose it to a greater danger? They vary for every type of resource. The things I need to worry about for a storage account is very different than what I worry about for a Kubernetes environment, for containers, which is very different than what I think about for DNS. So a Defender offerings tailored to understand what are the signals and what are the things I want to really lock down for different types of technology. There's monitoring. And monitoring can then feed into things like Sentinel, a SIEM, a source solution. There are many extensions which bring additional capabilities, both to maybe do configuration, but to also bring identities and integration and security and encryption. And of course, then there's management. Hey, patching. I can, through those extensions, automatically patch things. So all of these different things, I can use in Azure. It's a native part of that control plane. So then if we think about, well, Azure was capacity, great. I'm sitting here on premises. Well, I have capacity as well. I'm on premise and I have a set of capacity. And I've invested in this capacity. Hey, I'm not just going to move off of this and move everything to Azure. Yeah, I've got locations. Maybe I've got some anchors. I have these huge mainframes that I just cannot today move to Azure. So I need services near them for the performance reasons. I have things maybe from a regulatory perspective. There's things that I can't move to certain Azure regions. Now, those are becoming less and less, but it could still be I'm in a certain country where this doesn't apply. So I have some capacity that I'm exposing as different types of resource internally. Might be VMs, might be containers. They're the key ones we tend to see on premises. But I like this Azure model. I would like to bring some of these benefits to get the visibility into my resources, but then to apply things like the security, the policy, the RBAC, the defender solutions, that monitoring. I'd like that single pane of glass for the operations, patching the things. So if I think about the types of workloads I have, well, I could start with just operating systems. This could be exposed through a hypervisor. So it could be a virtual, but it could be a physical. It could be just bare metal. It could be Windows. It could be Linux. Now, I do want to stress as well, I'm drawing this as, hey, I've got on-prem capacity. This could equally be, shudder, in a different cloud. Hey, maybe I'm using another cloud, but I still want to bring some of those services, that single control plane, those capabilities to some of the resources I have elsewhere. So I'm drawing it as capacity on-prem, but it really could be these services anywhere. So in this case, hey, I have an operating system, physical, virtual, Windows, Linux. I can bring Arc to this. So this is where we start thinking about Azure Arc. So with Azure Arc, it's about extending that control plane elsewhere. And we can start by thinking about, hey, for servers. So there's an agent gets deployed. So now we're thinking about this for servers. These OS instances now become resources in the Azure portal. And I say Azure portal, but it's ARM. If I'm using the CLI or REST APIs, whatever that is, they're now part of that. So it's going to bring those Azure capabilities now to these just OS instances, physical, virtual, Windows, Linux. Policy, so my governance, security solutions, configuration, patching, monitoring. All of those capabilities will now be brought to these operating systems really wherever they may be. So it's all about extending that control plane now to an OS instance. Well, maybe my capacity, I'm a bit more advanced. I have Kubernetes. I have some CNCF compatible Kubernetes. Well, once again, great. Arc will install some pods in that Kubernetes environment. So now we have Arc for Kubernetes. And it's now going to bring, once again, those policy, those based on the gatekeeper solutions. It's going to bring me insights. Again, those OS instances, I get insights. My container environment, I now get insights about what's happening, insight into the pods, insight into nodes, defender security advisements, detecting when there's something happening. I'm going to get things like GetOps. So one of the things I can very easily, once I do this, is I could now point my Kubernetes cluster at a Git repo. And anytime a commit is made against that Git repo, I update the manifest, for example, it will pull that down and automatically deploy it onto my Kubernetes cluster. So I'm really lighting up this whole DevOps world very simply now through Arc for Kubernetes. So that's reducing some of the management. It's reducing maybe need for other services. I'm bringing those Azure services to my things on premises. But it really goes beyond that, because once I've now got this Kubernetes environment managed via Arc, remember all those nice PaaS services we had? We had these great data services, we had these app services, we had these machine learning services. Well, I can also, once I have this Kubernetes management via Arc, these great PaaS services, well, guess what? I can actually bring them down. So there's a whole set of additional Arc services that will build on top of a Kubernetes environment, because now I can deploy pods. So when I think about data, I can get Arc data services. So this could, for example, be SQL MI. This could be managed Postgres, hyperscale. These will be evergreen. They're managed. I will now just, within my environment, have a SQL MI instance. I will have a managed Postgres hyperscale instance. I no longer have all of those same worries and operational concerns anymore about or patching the database and worrying about this, that, and it's all just going to show up like it's another database in Azure. I get custom locations will show up in Azure that reflect this capacity I have on premises. Hey, I can bring app services down. Again, I'm not worrying about now maintaining some runtime, some environment to run my app on. Azure App Services, functions, logic apps, I can now run them on premise. The same environment and ideas I'm used to, I can do that. Hey, machine learning services, Arc machine learning, I can bring down. I can now do my training of models, for example, on premises. So it's all about, I can bring not just the Azure control plane to simplify the management, the operations, the security, all of those benefits that Azure brings to my Azure services elsewhere, on-prem or other clouds, but I can then even build beyond that and bring down those richer services to once again get an Azure-like experience. They're just evergreen, they're managed for me. Now there is other work being done around Arc. For example, I could think about, well, maybe, hey, that capacity, I do have a hypervisor. So I'm actually running my own hypervisor, which you probably are. So I've got some hypervisor here, and that might be VMware vSphere. It could be Azure Stack HCI. Well, guess what? I can also have Arc available here via this great, basically packaged virtual machine that will connect it into the Azure control plane. And what that's then going to let me do is, it's still on premises. So, hey, I'm still kind of creating my regular VMs, but that lifecycle management, the create, the modify, the delete, the stop, the start, I can now do that lifecycle management via the Azure control plane. Now I want to create a new VM on premises in my custom location on my VMware vSphere environment or my Azure Stack HCI. Hey, Arc is going to light that up. I can now do that. Now, it's not doing deep hypervisor management today. I'm not going to be creating my software-defined networks on premises through this feature today. But that basic lifecycle management of the workloads of the VM, absolutely, I can do through this. So this is really the key concepts we think about when I have this idea of, hey, Azure Arc is all about, yes, bringing in that control plane, but it can also bring so much more. It can actually bring those services. And that's how I would talk about it. Now, the key thing is I can interact, I can pivot based on the questions. For example, you could say, well, hey, you mentioned Azure Stack HCI. What is that exactly? Where does that fit? And you can explain the idea that, well, all of this was based around you had capacity. You had some maybe existing capacity, existing servers. But there may be scenarios where, once again, you want certain Azure services on premises, but maybe you don't have that capacity today. So there are various Azure Stack solutions, depending on the exact requirements. There's things like Azure Stack Hub, this complete turnkey appliance. It's very typically used in more disconnected scenarios. It's a complete local control plane, a complete local fabric that offers certain Azure services. There's things like Azure Stack Edge, which is a rack, an appliance that you put into your rack. I pay for it on a consumption basis, so basically as a monthly fee. It's delivered to me. I install it in my rack. It delivers certain Azure services that I need close, I need at my edge. Maybe it's running some sort of cognitive service. It's using vision APIs, for example, and it's detecting safety, or it's looking at certain sensor values, uses machine learning. It has to react super, super quickly. I need a tiny latency so it can react super fast. Even that maybe 20, 30 milliseconds to the cloud is too long. So we have Azure Stack Edge to bring certain Azure capabilities in this managed through the Azure control plane. There's really nothing I do to this box. It just delivers and it runs certain Azure services. Then there's things like Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI is really bringing me a hypervisor and more to on-premises. With Azure Stack HCI, the idea would be I would buy a series of nodes. So with Azure Stack HCI, for example, I can have 1 to 16 nodes in a particular cluster. I can even stretch that cluster over locations if I want. And what it's running is a special version, essentially, of Windows Server. But absolutely, we have things like Hyper-V as the hypervisor. But then it's using software-defined networking. It's using storage spaces direct, which is a hyper-converged storage. So it has local storage in each node, but it appears as though it's a shared storage across all those nodes. So it's replicating, it's resilient. It adds things like the Windows Admin Center on top for management, but it ties in very, very closely to Azure and its services. So this, at a very base level, gives me virtual machines. It's a hypervisor. It gives me VMs on premises, but I can add many services to this. I can add things like AKS. I can add things like a VDI solution. I can add things like SQL. So I can go and buy these nodes that are certified for Azure Stack HCI. I can even get my own hardware and install Azure Stack HCI myself, and it gives me this fantastic virtual environment. But then on top of that, and this is where they really shine, is I would absolutely put Arc on top. So Arc with Azure Stack HCI, then not only is the HCI known to Azure and I can do those core things, now all of the workloads inside it, those VMs I create, now become, hey, Arc for servers. They become managed via Azure. If I do the AKS, hey, I can now install data services, app services, machine learning services from Azure via that Azure Arc. So they really tie nicely together. So it's all about flexibility. There's lots of different offerings depending on what I need to, hey, whatever amount of maybe on premises, what I have, what I don't have, the types of interactions, type of service I want. That's the key goal. But it's all about shifting responsibility from things I, as the customer, are having to worry about, and tooling I have to buy, and resources I have to have people managing, to letting it just be an evergreen managed service, just like many of those services we have in Azure. So that was it. So that's how I would typically think about working. You see, I use the pen a lot. I draw it out as I'm talking about a certain item. And again, it lets me pivot. If a customer had a particular question on a particular aspect, hey, I can zoom in on certain parts. I can, as customers maybe have concerns, if there was a question, I can have a little parking lot and write that down, then give them this whiteboard afterwards as the notes, and it's very clear on follow-up items. So you can write these down. But this is how I do nearly all my meetings. My customers will laugh that, hey, it's a meeting with John. Oh, look, he's getting the whiteboard out. And this is how I do my presentations. But use the camera as well. I think it helps add to it. But that was it. People keep asking about, hey, Wood, how do you do your day job? So I thought it'd be fun to just kind of walk through an example. And this is a very typical type of interaction I do. But I hope that helps everyone. Until the next video, as always, take care.